Before a short introduction of our panelists, but I know that they probably don't need much of an introduction, some background on how this event came to be. Our steering committee's intention was to host an event to engage community, and it seemed simple enough. But in a room full of people who are deeply committed to communities and sustainability, we kept coming back to the question, what do we mean when we say community? We wrestled with it meeting after meeting and then decided that what might be most productive, most useful to us and communities would be to make the wrestling public. That public being everybody in the room and those who really wanted to be here but couldn't make it, and hence the recording. So each panelist will talk about how they locate community, who speaks, who is represented and not, and how they engage. To us, our three panelists this afternoon exemplify the research, theory, and practice that could ground today's discussion, and they are all heavily involved in the wrestling. I don't know how many people were able to join Kirsten's talk, thought-provoking talk on Tuesday, about how we could build a systemically resilient and fair economy for a world of artificial superintelligence. And if not, we can share the recording link as well. But it prompted Natalie to see what ChatGPT thought communities were between these three, and this is what it spit back. Their research shares a focus on Indigenous governance, community engagement, and sustainability, and their collaborative and interdisciplinary approaches aim to promote social justice, inclusion, and environmental sustainability. Apt and succinct, but when asking ChatGPT to locate community, it may prove interesting, and so we turn to our incredible panelists. I offer a brief introduction to each so we have more time to listen to them than talk about them, which in no way captures all of what they're doing. So for a more fulsome background, I encourage you to go to their websites. Dr. Curtis Boyer is assistant professor at JSGS, citizen of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, the first Alphonsine Lafond Tom Malloy Memorial Fellow on Leadership and Innovation in Indigenous Governance Fellow on Leadership and Innovation. Okay, with the Institute of with an Institute for Research on Public Policy, and the first of its kind research chair, the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School Research Chair in Métis Governance and Policy, exploring ways in which governance and policy-making process can be guided and informed by Métis culture, values, and tradition. Dr. Isabel Findlay is University Co-Director, Community University Institute for Social Research, CUSER, a longtime fellow at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives, and Professor Emerita of the Edwards School of Business. Throughout her career and every day, with a relentless and inspiring passion, she demonstrates her commitment to interdisciplinarity, intercultural, and intersectoral community-based research. And last but never least, Dr. Maureen Reid is UNESCO co-chair in Biocultural Diversity, Sustainability, Reconciliation, and Renewal, professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability, and special advisor to the Office of the Vice President Research. A committed transdisciplinary sustainability scientist, Maureen's research focuses on the social dimensions of sustainability, how people, processes, and institutions shape decisions about environment and development. All right, so I'll ask them each to speak for up to 12 minutes, and I'll give them a wave when they hit the 12. We're going to keep this nice and tight. And then after they've each had a chance to talk, we will have an open Q&A session. As last time, we will have somebody run the microphone around for the purposes of the recording for the questions. So without further discussion, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Boyer.
Thank you, Natalie. And I'm going to take full responsibility for that typo. I think I should have consulted ChatGPT maybe. So today I wanted to talk, we don't have much time, but I've tried to fit this into 10 minutes. I wanted to talk about something that I think is interesting and important, and that I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to think through in my role as the chair in Métis Governance and Policy, and the work that I do with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. And so To kind of be brief here, though, today, I want to say three kind of main points. I want to discuss how we define community, the importance of that. I want to highlight some of the issues of when we define community as at the individual level. That is to say that when we define community through our individual relationships to individuals or group of relations, that they are the representation of the community. And I want to highlight some of the benefits that I've been fortunate enough to experience in my work with Indigenous governments that we might be able to have as researchers in when we conceive of the community as the governance structure, as the representation of that community, as opposed to the individuals in our population sample or whatnot. And then I'm going to be able to speak through the benefits of, I think, that through the a little bit of an overview of what I see as a partnership that's developing between the University of Saskatchewan and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan government to talk through some of those benefits. But ultimately, I want to say today that I want to show that respecting Indigenous self-government and governance improves research relevance and impact. So that's kind of the overall goal here. Before I get into that discussion, though, I think it's important to talk about just community, what it means, and how it factors into research as I see it. I know my panelists will speak more in depth on this topic, but for me, I think one of the things I think how community and the factors into research generally, and I think is going to be true for most of the people in this room, and I think most likely everybody in the university, is that research is to benefit communities. I think we can conceive of a community to which our research benefits, whether it's a species or a country or city or the globe. There'll be something that we can conceive as the community as being the benefactor of our research. So, and I think that's important to notice that this is generally a goal of research, to make impact in community. And I think also community, especially with community focused research, community actually in that it's central to the way that we create our research objectives and define our methods, et cetera, provides a source of information for us. So, and two things I put here that I think is relevant here is that the kinds of information the community can give us when we're engaged with community engaged research is that around needs. So community gives us their needs, tells us what their needs are, whether it's direct or indirectly. That informs the research objectives of our projects, the outcomes that we're looking for, et cetera. And the other thing that the information that community gives us is an understanding of the impact that our research is making on the ground in community. And so, excuse me. So with these two kinds of information, I was thinking that it's important, therefore, to understand the node of information, or to put it another way, like it's important to understand how we conceive of community really impacts the way those two kinds of information come at us. It impacts the what the needs are and what we can measure as impact. So locating community at the individual level. So for some research, and I think this is particularly true for Indigenous focused research, is that the community has traditionally conventionally been located at the individual level. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. I think we can get into if we've got time in discussions, but the community is represented via our relationships to individuals. So, and there's a couple different consequences to that, I think. Firstly, I think that when we do that, when we locate the community at the individual level, it really undermines nationhood. And what I mean by nationhood, I mean that when we would measure community need or impact based on engagement with individuals, the information we're going to receive from them is going to miss the way that individuals are relationally constituted to their family, to the kinship ties, to their community, to the land, to their culture, language, basically the things that make up what, folks like Benedict Anderson would call as an imagined community, a nation. So you miss a lot of that constitutive sort of parts of the information when you are trying to just distill it from what your conversations or engagement with individuals or a group of individuals would be. And the other thing that I think is important here is that it also influences information. and I'll kind of, sorry if I'm kind of like going over this again in this conversation, but the when we think about engaged community work through the individual, I think the information that we will get ultimately is going to be limited. Individuals cannot represent the nation. The information that they're going to have are going to be limited to their personal relationships. And even within a particular community or nation, there's distinction. If we call, even when we think about Indigenous research in Canada, that should mean actually we shouldn't be saying that. We should be referring to the communities as closest to the level in which we can find to that distinction. So, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, these are distinct groups of Indigenous peoples within them. Those are distinctions also. And so even when you're thinking of an analytical structure to engage in research, you're going to find these distinctions are going to not be measured easily, or that. So you're going to have the breadth of priorities that drive your research are going to be limited, is essentially what I'm going to say here. And also in terms of the limits that this approach takes in terms of that I think is in particularly when we think of Indigenous self-government, and engaging with governments maybe in general, is that when you do just simply engage with individuals, you are missing a lot of mechanisms for change. And I guess what I mean by that is by engaging with Indigenous governments directly, given the fact that Indigenous governments are the representation of these people and their primary mode of operation is to benefit the lives of their members, and they do so via program development, policy development, and implementation. So when you are engaged with that individual level, you're missing these opportunities for change. And I guess to like use an example, if I was going to go to Moose Jaw and talk to some folks about the needs of Moose Jaw, and that's how I was going to get that kind of idea of the needs of the community. I'm obviously, going to miss a lot of the differences and nuances in Moose Jaw, and so that the priorities of my own research, that is the starting point of my research, the development of my questions, for example, are going to be limited. But also by bypassing the governance structure, say in the municipal government and the committees, the planning committees in the municipal government, I'm going to miss the opportunity for my research to have that impact that would drive change that I would want it to. So connecting back to that main point I said at the beginning of the talk, is that our research is designed to, and we want it to have that impact in communities. So by engaging with governance systems at the collective level, when it's there and available to us, is important because it benefits clearly both the drive and direction of our research and the setting of our priorities, but also the way that our impact can have change. And without that, I think when President Glenn McCollum of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan has said this a lot to me. He said, he mentions research as sometimes sitting on the shelf and collecting dust, and I really think that speaks to really the kind of mismatch that when we aren't using those mechanisms of change that are available to us, and having or creating those institutional relationships that allow for that, then research does sit on the shelf and collect dust and doesn't have the impact I think that we want it to. So when talking about, when thinking through the locating community at the collective level, or at the governance level, the process or structures to which a community, in this case Indigenous community, that represent them, I've had the opportunity to engage and work with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. That has, as a researcher, has been very formative for me, obviously, in understanding both the topic of my inquiry, because I'm a governance nerd, but also like thinking through of my role and the role of my research in community and for community. So, before I get into that, maybe it's useful for me to say, and for those folks who might not be aware, that the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan is a government, a Métis government, that is the political representation of Métis rights holders in this province. This government has signed multiple agreements with the federal government and has engaged with a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada. And again, like as I said earlier, as a government, its primary purpose is to represent the interests and needs of its citizens and provide impactful programs, services, policy, et cetera, to benefit them in their daily lives. And so, the University of Saskatchewan has begun to understand this fundamental shift towards that this is a government and what happens in our own work at the university when we actually account for that fact. And so the USask has, started with, I think, an MOU in 2017, but then moved on to a citizenship agreement signed between the university and MNS that was led by the Office of the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, and where there's an acknowledgement that as a government representing its people, it has a right to determine its own membership, and therefore the university established a co-governance or collaborative governance structure to verify Métis people, to ensure that resources that are directed for Métis students and folks here at the university go to Métis people, and as fundamentally as a recognition of self-government. So it's not about, anything more than what happens when we actually acknowledge that this is a government. I think it means that there's some changes in the university that have happened. And one of the other changes in terms of research, and which is represented by, oh no, you can go back, by the photo there, which is a signing of a research agreement to establish distinctions-based approaches to research and planning, signed in May, I believe. And in that agreement, and I'm going back to how this relates to research now. In that agreement, you can switch, please, Vicky. Thank you. There's a particular mention of let me start by saying this agreement basically is an acknowledgement of that Métis Nation of Saskatchewan as an Indigenous government represents the interests of Métis people. And then it goes through to determine, well, what does that mean for how we think about research? And one of the things that I'd like to talk about in this agreement is the mention of a establishment of an institute called the Métis Nation Institute for Research and Governance. And a couple things I'd like to mention about the Institute and how it links back to the discussion I had at the beginning of my talk around information, excuse me, is a couple different features. So in the agreement, it states that this Institute must be how many? Half a second? Okay. 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 That, and I'm going to try to not be one of those people that just keeps going anyway. I'm going to try to think here. Essentially, the Institute is a great example of how universities can create an institutional partnership and framework that, in recognizing that that a government has its primary job of representing and speaking for the interests, i.e. the needs of the community, as I mentioned earlier, and has through directors and ministries, the implements to create change through program development policy. It's created a sort of partnership that respects and celebrates academic freedom's role in making sure that research has the ability to make the impact that I think as all researchers would want to make in the end. So there's a really cool initiative that the university's taken on here, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of that. And I think it's a really great workable example that I totally would have blown you away by getting to all the details if I had planned this out properly, but you'll have to take my word for it. Thank you.
So what I want to do in my 12 minutes is take you on a journey that actually took 25 years plus. So what I want to talk about is what I've learned about what community means and why it matters, who gets to say. And for me, an important part of that process was finding institutional space for community building, for doing the kind of work. Because at the time that I was hired, you could not assume that your department or your college would support community engaged scholarship. Few of them knew what it meant even. But I'm glad to say that several of my colleagues from the Edwards School of Business are here today and can tell you things have changed. But for me, that was part of the process. And I want to tell you about the communities with whom I have learned so much with them. Next slide, please. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. The book on the left, I co-edited with my late husband, Lan Finlay, um, before I finished my PhD, because we were always thinking about community and community both in the university. How do you create a community of scholars that want to work together and find those communities to work with beyond the academy? That was a book based on a SSHRC-funded conference, and on the right is another book that was based on a SSHRC-funded conference. It was actually an International Summer Institute on the cultural restoration of oppressed Indigenous peoples, and brought people from all around the world. It was an amazing experience. And out of that came our establishment of the Indigenous Humanities Group. So that was one of the spaces. It didn't have a place. We met wherever. And what did we think we were doing? Well, we knew we did not like the add-on model of the university. You know, we'll just stick in this little bit extra and nothing will change, right? Whether it's Indigenous studies or women's studies, let's not contaminate the order of things. So we knew that's what we were resisting, but we had no idea how we were going about this. And I think that was part of the virtue. At the same time, as I was appointed, I became a fellow at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives, and that also was an incredibly important location for me. I did all my graduate teaching there, all my graduate supervision, and very soon after that, I joined CUSAR. I was, a junior member, but was embraced. The Canadian Centre is now 40 years old as an interdisciplinary centre. So we've been trying to change things for a long time. And CUSAR celebrates its 25th year this year. So why does all this matter? We understood that, control over memory is an essential part of political projects. And what we forget is as important as what we remember. And so that was part of the project, was to remember what had been submerged, what had been forgotten, and what it caused us to forget. Well, we were all, as my friend Marie would say, immersed in Eurocentrism. And that's why Linda Smith, who was here for that Summer Institute, describes research as probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. So that was the background against which we were trying to do something differently, and learning from Indigenous, feminist, qualitative researchers, leading a process of decolonization, which very importantly was about democratizing research. It was adding to those who had a say. And sharing responsibility and understanding we are responsible for the production and reproduction of identities and realities. Things are not just the way they are. And what was at stake, as the TRC said, was our reputation as a prosperous, just, and inclusive democracy. And education had to do its job so that we would not perpetuate ignorance and racism. So my very first field research, significant field research, was in the Arctic. And it was on a project on the meaning of cooperative membership in the context of globalization. And that's where someone trained in the origin story of cooperatives as being Rochdale in England. It was a huge learning. I suddenly discovered cooperation has multiple histories, and I need to come to terms with that and understand what it means. I also discovered that social innovation is not down here, but up there. They were the ones that took co-ops and made multi-purpose co-ops. It's everywhere in the community. And we're talking about communities of about less than 1,000 people. So how do they manage to do what they do with apparently scarce resources? So that caused me to really think about things. And as you can see, ownership, control, governance is critical, and that the training in the co-ops translated into the Nunavut legislature. My next big learning was again a SSHRC-funded research project. This time it was a partnership of QSAR and the center. Lou Hammond Kettleson was the overall lead, and I was the lead for the Saskatchewan research. And we worked together with the Northern Trappers for over 10 years. The funding was for 6, but you don't stop when the funding stops, you keep going. And what we uncovered was a proud history of a sustainable knowledge economy, something that was there long before the mainstream thought it invented the term. And we came to understand in working together the role of law, policy, and regulation in undermining and actively impoverishing the trappers in the North. And 2 decisive moments, the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, by which the feds gave the province jurisdiction over natural resources without ever talking to Indigenous rights holders. And then in 1946, the provincial government then also decided to make a major decision with no consultation with Indigenous peoples, and with absolutely paying no attention to the geographical or the cultural or traditional boundaries. Suddenly, Saskatchewan was 2 wildlife zones, management zones. And so the trappers, with almost no infrastructure, had to govern the whole of the North, which of course is slightly less accessible than the South. And so when I met them, I was dealing with the community-driven research. And so it was the community that came to me with maps and stories and said, we want to make a change. We've become a cooperative because we want to revision for hope, healing, and health. And I don't need to remind you of the circumstance. Anyway, over the years, we developed what we called the 3 R's, research, relationships, and reflexivity. It was a constant investment in thinking about how we were doing things, who was benefiting, how it was, as we remapped the territory and retold stories. And from their point of view, what was critical to the ethical protocols was fun, food, and friendship. Those were key, and we had to invest in those. And that's how, and intergenerational dialogue was a major part of this, as the community came together, from the youth to the elders and trappers at different levels. And that's how they remembered, right? The most important part, I think, was their sharing their memories and coming to a realization of what trapping meant. That it wasn't this distorted reduction, but it was about land management, it was about medicine, it was about health, it was about education, it was about justice, learning your place in the world, what you could take and what not. My next one, this was also funded by SSHRC at the same time, the Social Economy Suite. And we were working with Inclusion Saskatchewan, and Judy Hanna was their rep, on self-directed funding as an option, as a new program for people living with intellectual disabilities. So we did 2 studies, lots of excellent research. We covered jurisdictions all over the world. We covered jurisdictions within Canada in the second one, and still the government pushed back. They would not engage. It was not going to be a program. But in the third one, it suddenly clicked, this oppositional dynamic, that we were part of that. I had to admit that in my head, they'd become the enemy. And it was only when we began to use engagement principles that things changed. Yeah. And so that is indeed how we disrupted the normal and got a program in which they invited self-advocates, people with intellectual disabilities, to help design and implement. Next one, thank you. This one I'll just mention very briefly. It was a project on the Mi'kmaq humanities in Atlantic Canada. And the biggest learning was an elder said to us, if you want to understand the Indigenous humanities, teach the baskets. And that got us into a huge, huge area of research, understanding the meaning of the baskets. How do you go from a tree to something as beautiful as this? So it taught us an awful lot and stretched the terms of the 7th co-op principle. Yeah, I'm going to skip. Yeah, I'll just let you see. This one mattered to me because this was at Station 20 West, which the community had to fundraise for and build when the government withdrew funding. And what we looked at was the role of community campus engagement in poverty reduction in the core. And it was amazing. And notice the university's Office of Community Engagement and Outreach was part of that process. And it was remarkable in terms of what it taught us about a place of teaching and healing. And I'll just go to my last slide, if I may. Last one. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten. This one just happened in February. This was designed by our lived experts, and that's why that mattered to me, because it was their project. But I'll go to the last. So for me, what all of this has taught me is that we need to hold the institutions to account. If community engagement is a priority, there needs to be resources and there need to be appropriate metrics and so on, metrics, ethics, budgeting. Community makes our research possible in very real ways, committing money, committing resources when we put in applications. And yet, where do they get access to our institutional resources? That, to me, remains a huge issue. At QSAR, we've invested in creating infrastructure and capacity, and these are just some examples. So we're responsible too. It's not only the institution must do this, but what we can do as well. And then community engaged research can be a truly transformative thing. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I am going to take you back to the last century and actually talk just about one project or one set of insights that I gained from going into community for pretty much the first time outside of my PhD work. So I worked on Northern Vancouver Island in the late 1990s, and I wanted to learn more about women who supported industrial forestry during times of very rapid restructuring of the policy landscape. So Kirsten kind of set me up really nicely because what she described around the Great Bear Rainforest actually happened afterwards, but she also talked about the demonstrations that had been happening on Vancouver Island. So in this region, there had been massive protests. The eco-feminist peace camp at Clayoquot Sound, which was at that time the largest civic demonstration in Canada's history, where about 850 people were arrested. But there are also women and men who were protesting against government regulation, against the fight to protect old growth forests as well. And many of them were opposed to ecofeminism. And so in the late 1990s, I visited a lot of forestry dependent communities. So I've kind of restricted my comments really to how community is defined. And I'm a geographer by training, and so I can't really resist showing you some maps. So, when I was looking for some maps to show today, I looked at this and I went, wow, it's kind of blank, And when I went to Google, I was struck by how simply zooming in and zooming out erases and rewrites, in a sense, many kinds of human and other habitation. So this one looks rather blank. If you look at this one and you look really hard, there's an invisible line north of Campbell River. And it's about an hour's drive from Campbell River, and there's a line that cuts across the island, separating the north from the south, not too differently from Saskatchewan. So you can't see that? Funny, because when I visited the North Island, it was a community. It was vibrant, proud, and perceived to be under enormous threat. Here's some more communities if you zoom in. So the line still isn't there, but you can see more of the individual places. Some, but not all, were established and remain named by people indigenous to those lands. Others were named and remained named by Spanish visitors and other European settlers. Geographers, like me, have been trained to think about communities in a territorial sense, by which I mean lines and dots on a map. So on this map, you can see some of those that I visited: Was, Port McNeill, Port Hardy, then a little bit farther south, Port Alberni, and Ucluelet is just off the map. These places have physical boundaries. But as communities, lines and dots on a map are not really a very good definition. I ended up, in the work that I did, just calling them forestry towns. But you can call them communities for other reasons. So this is a picture of the mass demonstration, and some of the signs that you see in this demonstration. This had 14,000 people on the lawn of the legislature. Some of the signs appeared in the communities where I was visiting. And thinking about communities of interest, right? They're social spaces or networks where people come together for common purpose or obligation. And my own work is in environmental governance. So often people come together and they are, in the jargon of my literature, called stakeholders. But Indigenous partners have explained that that they are not stakeholders, but rights holders. So they don't necessarily share the same interests. They might, but they do have a bundle of rights that demand recognition. But more recently, as I've worked with Indigenous peoples here in Saskatchewan, we've come to use the term amongst ourselves as shared responsibility holders. And in governance, I think it's a really important distinction that people don't just come together because they want to protect their rights, but also that they understand that they share in the responsibilities to advance their interests, it may be, but it may be environment and sustainability. So back to communities of interest, there are multiple ones. We can think about them in terms of age, sometimes gender identity, ethnic origin, religion, sometimes even leisure pursuits. But the one that I came to talk about quite a bit in the work that I did was occupational communities. And what's important, I think, is that sometimes communities can be formed as oppositional or sometimes as allies. So communities are not simply static, and they're certainly not, they're complex, put it that way. So the cork boots built this country. If you know how to pronounce that first word, you might have a little bit of an entry into that community, right? But it stakes a claim. And communities of attachment are where people identify in a common way. So a forestry community could be drawn as lines on a map, but really it's an attachment that supports collective association and collective action. So it includes how people attach to each other, as well as how they attach to the land and they understand their relationships to land. So within forestry, some of the women who I was working with attached to logging in a very particular way. And they express affiliation with, and I'm quoting directly, big men, big machines, and big trees. Okay, where men do dangerous and backbreaking work. And they have very specific attachments to particular people and to land. Feminists have used the term social group often instead of community because they have said that it avoids romanticizing community, that social group can be identified as a shared sense of identity and associated practice. So social status or gender identity, but it doesn't have that sort of romantic feel sometimes that communities do. See if I can get that. Okay. So sense of community means belonging to its place, but also identifying with its institutions, its people, the land, and its boundaries. And if we think about ourselves as Canadians, we often identify with iconic landscapes as part of our own national identity and community. But community is also a way that a social group can classify who's inside and who's outside. It may be a way for people to draw together for common purpose and positive change, but it's also a way to stereotype and set others outside. Possibly associations do both. So this sign says, forestry feeds our businesses and families. This is a Greenpeace-free zone, clearly demarcating us versus them. And this was actually on the hangar in the airport where I landed when I first started to do my research. And so with the quotation, right, that from one of the people, if you're coming up here to point out the errors of our ways, you better be careful because you're in a logging town. And this is one of the very polite things that was said to me when I first arrived. So, but communities, as I said, they create insiders and outsiders, but there's a lot of things that communities don't do as well. The definitions that I've talked about don't tell us how to understand or work with or work within communities. And they don't necessarily reveal the key characteristics or even the members of those communities. And I think the speakers have talked about that better than I have. As researchers, I think we see what we want to see. We see what we're willing to see. So we can, someone can still come to Saskatoon for a fairly significant period of time without knowingly meeting an Indigenous person. I worked for a while in Squamish, BC, where at the time, 13% of the population was Indo-Canadian. I knew that, but I didn't see them. And that may speak something more about myself as a researcher than about the community itself. And when I worked on Vancouver Island almost 30 years ago, I knew that there were Indigenous people living on the island, the North Island, and in the towns where I worked. But I didn't get out of my comfort zone to meet them on their terms, on their territory. At that time, I chose the comfort of ignorance. I want to say one of the things I'm very grateful about in moving from Vancouver to Saskatoon is really the opportunity to meet and learn from Indigenous partners. And I'm not going to talk about that today specifically, But just some observations that, for me, physical proximity doesn't necessarily lead people to building social relationships. This requires shared history, long-standing relationship building, reflexivity, the kinds of characteristics that the speakers have already talked about. But communities also establish boundaries, right? That communities are not necessarily inclusive. They can also be ways of setting people apart. And boundaries can be located both within and between communities, but they're not necessarily fixed or fluid, or sorry, fixed, but they may be fluid. So geographical mobility may change boundaries around community. Social strife, policy change, these kinds of things can also change boundaries. And communities might not always be defined by themselves, but they're influenced by social and structural processes. Members of communities may be placed in those communities, and there are some obvious examples across Canada of that. And lastly, communities aren't always visible to researchers. And as researchers, we may only see those that that wish to become visible to outsiders. So in a sense, does this fence line keep people in or out? Is it out? Will the broken gate offer an entry point in? And the last thing I want to say is community a fraught term? Absolutely. It's really complicated, but I think it's also quite meaningful. So I'd rather wrestle with it than to excise it from my vocabulary. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Very excellent topics and coming at it from your own research and from different spaces. So we do have a mic set up, and we can also run around with the mic for any questions that you may have. And give our speakers an opportunity to speak to the things that they had to leave on the cutting room floor.
Thank you so much. To all three of you, this is really very insightful and very inspiring for me. I have a question for Dr. Boyer. I really appreciate and take on your point about the importance of engaging with national governments, Indigenous national governments, and also the point that an individual can't necessarily represent the needs or impacts of a community. So those points make a lot of sense to me. My work and research is primarily in my home country in Ecuador. And for about 16 years, I've been working with citizens of an indigenous nation called the Shibiar Nation in Amazonia, northwestern Amazonia. And in that time, most of the projects that we've done have been engaging through the national government of the Shibiar Nation. And some projects have been through grassroots communities, kind of communities of practice. And what's interesting to me is that although I know for a fact, after 16 years, I know for a fact that the Shibiar government operates in the best of good faith, they don't necessarily have the capacity to cover all of the needs, temporary or long-term needs of different communities within that nation. And so actually what ended up happening is that a lot of the projects that were rooted through the national government were the ones that ended up producing research that ended up on shelves gathering dust. And it was actually some of the research with grassroots communities that ended up being more apparently or seemingly impactful. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you. And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm not aware of that particular community. But the issue of capacity is important. And I'm glad you raised it because, and I guess to me, I would respond to that by saying there's an issue of capacity, and that, when as researchers, we like as you mentioned, when you're engaging with the government, you have an idea of what your outcomes for your research might be, and then there are apparatuses from within that community or government that could deploy it or create some kind of change from it. I guess to me, there's two things here. There's the motive of the researcher that we want to create change with our research, and then there are the realities that we have to deal with. And to me, and I've come up with the same issue, especially just simply because with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, it's growing extremely fast as a government structure. So a lot of these things are being rolled out and developed, and there's a sort of institutions being built. The relationship between these things are kind of they're being figured out. And no government is perfect, right? So I guess I should start with saying no government is ever perfect, and you'd probably be able to find the same example if you looked in Saskatchewan, the province, and the way that provincial dollars are provided to nonprofits to increasingly provide services to the communities instead of the government itself. But so there's that issue, and then there's the issue of actually understanding where in the government you might be able to be placed. So there's and direct your research. I found that there's a bit of homework that needs to be done. First, you recognize that they're self-government. There's a need and value to engage with that structure, that process, and then there's a value to learning about where you fit and your research fits in that. And I think given that like nothing's going to be perfect, but that's something I found personally is valuable to understand first the governance structure of the processes, then understand how I can formulate my research to engage in those mechanisms for change more effectively. Because if you just say call somebody up in the government head office and be like, I got this research, let me know how it works, they're not going to be able to help you. You got to know which department or whatever internally the structure is going to be more efficient for that outcome that you're looking for. Does that help? Yeah, great.
Thanks, Shelley. And very much thank you to all of our panelists today. I'm curious if any of the three of you would like to speculate on the future of this realm of research. We're, well into an era of awareness of the need and the value of this kind of an approach, decades in. And we're also seeing really interesting signs of very large portions of society just not seeing value in what a whole lot of us in these kinds of institutions do. So where do you think we may be headed, and what ought we be paying attention to in community researcher relationships and that whole picture in the future?
I guess I'll take a stab, in part because right now I'm co-editing a special issue of the Engaged Scholar Journal on precisely that topic. So, I really appreciate the question. I don't have all the answers by any means. I do think community engaged scholarship is the hope for the future. I think democratizing research is critical. We need more voices engaged, and those that are not typically thought of as sources of research knowledge. One of my examples that I skipped over was the point-in-time homelessness counts, and what I've learned working with that community, their capacity to recreate community, to build homes out of cardboard, and care about the future and care about the community. And so what I find again and again is how many people from the homelessness community are volunteers in our community, building things every day, championing those that are not otherwise heard. They're some of the most eloquent, knowledgeable people I know. And so I learn every day from them. And I just wish more people heard them. And, the point about research that sits on shelves, that's something that has motivated me for many years. How do you make a difference? And part of it is Linda and Graham Smith, when they were here in the 90s, said, don't expect things just to change. You must use multiple strategies in multiple locations. And that to me, again, remains critical, that you've got to go to those powerful places. Maureen and I worked in the context of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. That was Indigenous peoples and colleagues that told me, you've got to accept this invitation, you've got to go and take these messages, and you can and should change things from inside. And so that remains inspiring to me, that, with my power and privilege, if I can't keep going and doing the work, seeing the models in the community. So, and I just hope that our institutions pay attention to those that are giving so much in our communities.
Okay, other questions? Nick?
So much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. That was great presentation. My name is Megan Philitry. I work in the College of Education in international initiatives, and I'm also a PhD student in education. And so my question is actually from a student perspective. I really appreciate you sharing these examples of how each of you are doing research and community-based research in good, sustainable ways, or finding more sustainable ways to do it with the 3 R's, reflexivity, reciprocity, and relationship, I believe it was. Can you share some examples or your hope for students and training students in community-based research and sustainable ways, and how maybe you are doing that, or if you see students understanding this way of community-based research and sustainable research with and for communities? Thank you.
Is this one on? Yeah, it is. I feel like I should turn the mic over to a few of the people who are sort of hanging around the edges. So some of my students are here. But I think what's important, it's really hard, I think, for students to come in, particularly if they're master's students, for example, because they're not here for very long. And building the relationships is a long-standing task. So I think it's incumbent upon us as faculty to start to build those relationships and to have those long-standing relationships, if you will, that then students can come into. So one of them that I have had that's local is with the Red Bear Lake Biosphere Region, and I've been there working there for 25 years is the anniversary this year. So, and anyone who works there now gets told, whatever you do, don't screw it up, because there are other people down the line, right? Having said that, I'm also really impressed by how there are students here in the room who have had to build their own relationships, and that they have done that through really concerted effort of spending time, whether it's back and forth in community, undertaking, adapting research methods so that they are tailored to community needs and interests, and really finding out, what does community want? Like, as Isabel was saying, what do they want? How can they then serve the needs that they're hearing about, and negotiating that with community members? And so I'm really proud of all of the students that I have who have been, taking that ethos with them. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say is that I'm also really proud of them as part of a community themselves, as a lab group where they are giving each other the kind of mentorship and tips and suggestions about how to move forward, very practical kinds of things when students don't know what to do next, or maybe they hit a roadblock, or they want to weigh out one suggestion against the other. So I found it a really, really nurturing collective in that sense.
That's a great question. I've just got one thought came to mind because you mentioned the 3 R's. And if anything, I would suggest, and I say this to my students, is that one thing that I've learned through the academy is to not take my ability to accomplish any of those things seriously. Often I come to take for granted that I have the ability to self-reflect, for example. But I've learned that when you go into a space, like say in self-government has done this for me, when you go into a space where there are different institutional policies, different ways of being, but there's a whole things that we take here for granted at the university that support a way of thinking, a way of being in the world. And you go into a place that another government that is essentially an institutional epistemic space where you don't have the authority anymore. That puts into perspective, I think, how you think is actually relationally constituted to the environment you're in. And so it's very important in learning about, community need to recognize that you can't learn, but, and that's the thing I think also motivates me is when you would pick, work on the individual level, you gain relationships, you still have that baggage from the university and from your past experiences. You really have to get out to a community that has its own rules and processes and be subjected to them. And then I think you become pitiful or humble in a way that to acknowledge that you're probably never going to be there, but they have the answers, and it's a back and forth like that. It's the best you can do.
Any other questions? We have time for about one or two more if there are any. I'm a teacher by background, so I'm giving you the lengthy pause thing. All right. Well, there's one more, Michael.
Don't be worried. It'll be fine. So very stimulating panel, and thank you. You did hard work for us, and risk-taking work and very sort of deep thinking work. And it is very much, I've taught the sociology of community and community development in one version or another for 20 some odd years. And I learned a lot listening to this panel. So probably want to invite you all to my class or something like that. Take advantage of your thinking. But, one thing that Curtis made me think and Isabel made me think, and Maureen actually too, same ideas about the sort of the problem of coloniality, that, the coloniality of rural development is an article I recently helped to write, book chapter. And, the problem that the dominant discourses have gotten into Métis and First Nation and every kind of community, and they're hegemonic, which doesn't mean they aren't being resisted or there aren't alternatives, or there aren't sub-communities within the community that are resisting. But it's very difficult. So that's why I take very seriously the questions you've asked about who is the member of this community, who speaks for this community. Are they going to speak the same way when we've had a beer on the porch, as that scientist said, and we are able to meet each other as human beings and so on, and tell me their worries about where they're headed and why they feel trapped by the pathways that they seem to be on and so on. So I've said enough. I think you're very smart people. You know what I'm asking. I think I'll put down the mic.
Comment?
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate where you're coming from, and I think that it relates to sort of like the reality that we live in, all of us, and that's why I think building true partnerships matter, because ultimately, as an academic, and I get myself into trouble thinking that I'm an expert, that I even identify what coloniality looks like in another quote community. Because we're here to study and understand and analyze from, perceivingly something from the outside of those environments. And so to me, I think there's a fine line between kind of as an academic thinking we're outside of that, but also providing, and again, it goes to self-government to me, and people can conceive of that in different ways, is simply if you have the ability to build your institutions in a way for you to exercise your collective self-determination. And to me, then it doesn't matter what it looks like, if it's colonial or not. We're all in a soup together. But so that to me provides I think a framework to understand or navigate that space. But I totally agree that we can't get outside of that the colonial soup that we're all swimming in. But there are structures that allow people to paddle. Put it that way.
When we've completed the Mi'kmaq Humanities research, which again took several years, we published a book. And Marie said, I don't want you to write about what you learned about Mi'kmaq. I want you to write about what you learned about yourself. And I went, gulp. That went against everything, putting me at the center. But it was an incredibly useful project because it forced me to come to terms with my own history. Scots-born Canadian, who had learned to internalize shame about my accent, about my background, because that's what we were taught. I went to school and was not permitted to use my own language. And so coming to terms with that, understanding why I had done the work I'd done over the years, it all made sense. So I was very grateful. It's not that I got out the other end to reinforce Curtis's point, but it gives you some control to have understanding.
I mean, I'll just say really briefly, and if you learned internalized shame, I also learned internalized guilt, right? And guilt for something that I didn't understand, and I would say I still don't fully understand. But that kind of liberal guilt that I grew up with is pretty persistent. But a couple of things that I've, one of who was then called an Aboriginal liaison officer for Parks Canada, I had met with him a number of years ago, and I said, biosphere regions, they're not really connecting very well with Indigenous people. Why is that? And he said, because you guys never get out of your comfort zone. You never you never come into our territory, and you invite us to things, but you never get uncomfortable. We're always playing by your rules. And that short conversation really turned around the advice that because I started to work with biosphere regions across the country, and we started to have, a multi-year kind of reckoning with how we work with people on whose territories those designations rest. And it's been a process of unlearning and relearning, and that will continue. So for as long as I really frankly learned almost nothing, I will continue to have to learn about that and unlearn some of those lessons, and to relearn as Isabel said, who we are, before I think we can be effective partners, whether it's with Indigenous peoples or with others in Canada.
Thank you. Well, can you join me in thanking our panelists one more time?